So you guys know the most powerful Middle Eastern politician lives in Tampa, Florida, right? I'm talking about Michael E. Kurilla, the commander of United States Central Command. Over the past 75 years, the Pentagon has divided the world up into progressively more and more heavily garrisoned imperial jurisdictions. Since 1986, the Senate confirmed leaders of these unified combatant commands have reported directly to the President through the Defense Secretary, cutting out the rest of the military establishment. Reporters and historians tend to describe these figures as the equivalent of Roman proconsuls or British viceroys. Democratic presidents tend to defer to these commanders with few legal reservations. Republican presidents, or at least Donald Trump, set them free to do whatever the hell they want. Thanks to 9/11, for the past 2 decades, Central Command, or Centcom, has been the most active of the commands. 2 of the past 3 confirmed defense secretaries used Centcom leadership as a stepping stone to that role. Now, I guess you could disagree with me that Kurilla is the most powerful Middle Eastern figure. I mean, I can't think of anybody else who can kill pretty much anybody he wants in the region with more or less complete confidence that nobody will shoot him back, but your definitions may vary. I'm bringing up General Kurilla to introduce the topic of today's video. The fact that the United States is in no way withdrawing from the Middle East. Sure, we are less committed compared to the absolute peak years with 160,000 US troops in Iraq in 2007 or 100,000 US troops in Afghanistan in 2010 and 2011. But those periods of time were obscenely expensive and have been proven by history to have been a complete waste of time. Anybody who looks at the US troop level peaks in Afghanistan and Iraq as the standard we should be aiming for needs to have their heads examined. The truth is that the US remains insanely overcommitted to the Middle East. We still have tens of thousands of troops there, and we are maintaining an infrastructure for the launch of the US's next pointless trillion-dollar Middle Eastern war. All we are waiting for is a spark, and all the US soldiers in the region function as exactly the sorts of human targets that could provide that spark. This overcommitment is especially frustrating because it's getting less and less necessary by the week. The US presence in the region is supposedly about oil and Israel, but neither of those interests are in any danger anymore. And when they were in danger, we didn't need any trillion-dollar warbait boots on the ground to protect them. During the Cold War, Israel was in real danger for decades. It had serious military rivals on its borders, and those rivals were heavily backed by the Soviet Union, one of the world's 2 superpowers. Back then, the United States had no significant military presence on the ground in the Middle East. But that didn't stop us from being able to save Israel with vital supplies during 1973's Yom Kippur War. We can do everything we need to do to safeguard Israel from our bases in Germany and Malta. That's been historically proven. But our regional on-the-ground presence keeps growing, even as Israel has become one of the safer countries on the planet. The Soviet Union is long gone. Egypt has been working closely with the United States and Israel since 1979, and Jordan signed a peace deal in 1994. Syria is in ruins, and Israel's relationship with Syria's Russian Air Force is so friendly that the Israeli Air Force is able to constantly bomb Syria's government and its allies. Oh yeah, and Israel has nukes. This is not a country that is in any current danger. Oil is even less of an issue. During the Cold War, when we had vastly fewer troops on the ground in the Middle East, we did actually need oil from the region, and we were capable of protecting it with almost no presence on the ground. In the late 80s, we fought a fairly intense naval and air war against Iran to force them to allow Saddam Hussein and his allies to continue to export oil. The tanker war doesn't get talked about for a bunch of reasons. We are embarrassed that we put all that effort into saving Saddam a year or 3 before we fought him. We are horrified that the USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killing 290 people. But I also suspect we don't like to talk about how easily we destroyed the Iranian Navy. It kind of makes our ongoing presence in the Persian Gulf look silly and redundant. And that was back when we actually needed oil from the Middle East. Thanks to the shale oil revolution, we are vastly less dependent on that region. We still use a bit of Saudi and Iraqi petroleum today, in California specifically, but thanks to US production, we don't actually need it. And Middle East oil security doesn't need us either. This was demonstrated quite violently 3 years ago. In September of 2019, after years of Saudi terror bombing of Yemen, Iran and its Yemeni allies blew up Saudi oil facilities, representing 5% of daily world oil production. This was an opportunity for that trillion-dollar war with Iran that the Pentagon has been seeking for decades. But Donald Trump was in power, and in one of the best moves of his career, he simply chose to not do anything about it. And the United States choosing to do nothing to defend the oil ended up leading to expanding peace and security. Now that MBS knows we won't back him up, he has opened up diplomatically to Iran. The 2019 attacks also convinced Saudi Arabia to start pursuing peace in Yemen much more seriously, making 2022 the first year of the past 8 without heavy Saudi bombing of that poor country. The main constraint on the Middle East's contribution to the world oil market remains Obama and Trump's murderous sanctions on Iran. So we don't need US troops in the Middle East to defend either of our main interests there. The region actually becomes more peaceful and safer the less involved we are, and the US public would really prefer it if there wasn't a single US soldier in the region. So of course we are remaining just as massively overcommitted as we always have been. I think most media sources, including this one, do the public a disservice by focusing on Iraq and Syria. Those missions are really bad, but they are barely the tip of the iceberg. The estimated 2,500 troops we have in Iraq and the completely illegal 900 troops we have in Syria are in the most danger. These are the human targets whose deaths are most likely to launch our next trillion-dollar war with Iran. It makes sense to focus on them, and they are often under attack by the majority of Iraqis and Syrians who do not want them there. But if you focus on just these two countries, it's easy to get the sense that the US has withdrawn in comparison with earlier eras. That would be a mistake. Focusing on a country or two leaves out the broader story of US empire that Middle East expansion is just a small part of. In the mid-20th century, when the combatant command structure was being set up, Washington, D.C. still wasn't quite sure it wanted to be in the world-running business. The commands were organized around defending the United States and had names like Alaska Command and Caribbean Command. The big exceptions back then were European and Pacific commands that were built around World War II US troop deployments that had yet to leave Europe and Asia. Those US forces in Europe and Asia still haven't left today, and most Middle Eastern US forces aren't going anywhere either. Back in the 1940s, the United States was more concerned about not looking too imperial. The formation of a command for all of North America was deferred for decades because we didn't want to offend Canada. Southcom was born out of the Caribbean Command in the 1960s to operate the US's dirty wars against communism in Latin America. But by the 1970s, when Vietnam made US imperialism domestically unpopular for a brief moment, most elements of the national security establishment agreed that Southcom should be disestablished. Strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, for a variety of reasons, the president just never got around to doing that. I think the Southcom story is important because it illustrates how sticky US military jurisdiction is. Cuba going communist in the 1960s inspired a US military expansion to Latin America. In the 1970s, everybody agreed that that had gone too far and that it should be rolled back, but somehow Southcom just never lost any of those resources and administrative structures. They were all there, ready for the first Bush to use in Panama and Bill Clinton to use in Colombia. A similar period of fake withdrawal is what the Middle East is experiencing today. At some point between Reagan's evil empire battling in the 1980s and Obama's duty to protect in the 2010s, the United States military stopped worrying about looking like an empire. The 1990s were especially important in this evolution because after the Cold War, the US military was desperate for reasons to exist, and more active combatant commands became necessary to provide these excuses, from Yugoslavia to East Timor and Colombia. It may seem surprising that these commands create more threats than they solve, but that's honestly the point. Creating imperial busywork that keeps the US military-industrial complex ticking over. The United States no longer has any natural enemies, so the combatant commands go out into the world and they create them. Before Centcom was founded in 1983, the United States fought very few wars in the Middle East. Since 1983, we've been fighting in that region almost constantly. First, Centcom saved Saddam Hussein from Iran. Then it fought 2 wars against Saddam, with a decade of lucrative bombing of Iraq in between. Centcom spent the 1990s defending Saudi Arabia's jihadists from Saddam Hussein. Then we spent 2 decades kind of fighting those jihadists in the form of Al-Qaeda. If you look at these 4 decades of fighting all together, as Andrew Bacevich does in his excellent book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, it all begins to look a bit ridiculous. It would be funny if it wasn't all so pointlessly and tragically violent. By 9/11, the entire world was already explicitly divided into US areas of interest, and that day's aftermath accelerated the process, driving enough US interest in Africa to give it its own US imperial administration, AFRICOM. You guys know the names Africa and Asia come from Roman imperial jurisdictions, right? I'm beginning to wonder if names like Centcom and EUCOM will last for millennia as well. That's how long-lasting I'm beginning to suspect US empire could be. But I digress. AFRICOM's founding in 2008 led directly to widespread destruction, chaos, and economic stagnation. But that's a story I've told in a different video. It's General Kurilla's central command that controls the Middle East, and Centcom is in a process of consolidation and expansion, not withdrawal. Hey there, quick note from the editing process. It occurs to me I probably should have mentioned the withdrawal from Afghanistan. That was a Centcom responsibility. And you know what? I think that Donald Trump and Joe Biden deserve a Nobel Peace Prize for finally ending that 40-year war in Afghanistan that Leonid Brezhnev started. I think that'd be great, but that's not the world we live in. The world we live in is one where Joe Biden was roundly condemned for months in the US media because it's owned by defense companies and saw his approval rating plummet. I think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, as good as it was, is probably the last time in my lifetime we'll ever see a US president withdraw from anything because we punished Biden for it. And nobody else is going to know Washington, D.C. as well as Biden did. So it's just not going to happen. That was the last withdrawal. I loved it. I said nice things about it. Nobody else did. Before we get into this, let me point out the many grains of salt with which you should take these numbers. These are just the most recent publicly disclosed numbers that I could find. They are definitely wrong. The Pentagon often hides these numbers. In some cases, like during most of the Trump administration, they were straight up lying to the president and the public about how many people they have in the region and their plans for them. But in other cases, in the name of national security, the Pentagon is open about not disclosing troop numbers. Most deployments in AFRICOM and CENTCOM are small handfuls of special forces training foreign militaries. The Pentagon usually only tells us about larger bases. These numbers are also always changing. They are also undercounts because they don't tend to include civilians and contractors who are not officially enlisted in the US military, but are also present on US bases. Oh, and even though we have a century's worth of reforms dedicated to solving these problems, the Defense Department famously has poor organization and a lot of bureaucratic infighting. It's entirely possible that the US military does not have a complete picture of what the US military is actually up to. Enough caveats. Tampa, Florida's military empire includes those few thousand guys in Iraq and Syria. CENTCOM's local headquarters is in Qatar. For much of the past 2 decades, this tiny country housed 13,000 US troops, or even many more. Under the pressure of war in Europe and a hoped-for war over Taiwan, that number has decreased dramatically under Biden. But we still have 8,000 troops there. That's apparently what withdrawal means. Only a measly 8,000 US troops, pointlessly defending one of the smallest countries in the world. Moving north, we incredibly still have over 13,000 troops in Kuwait across numerous military installations. Apparently the focus in Kuwait is on US Army assets. The focus in Bahrain is the US Navy, where somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 US sailors and civilians are based. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are traditionally a little more prickly about hosting US troops. One Saudi Arabian in particular blew up Lower Manhattan over the issue 21 years ago. But because the two richest Gulf countries have done such a poor job crushing their poorest neighbor, 5,000 US troops are now necessary to protect these monarchies from Yemen. So that's most of 40,000 US troops right there. And it's probably an undercount for all the reasons I listed earlier. Beyond these numbers, we also spend tens of millions of dollars every year maintaining bases in even more countries, like Oman, staffed with skeleton crews of US personnel and local militaries that can be massively scaled up on a few weeks' notice. It's very hard to parse out exactly how much all of this costs, but a plausible estimate that I saw recently claimed that the US taxpayer is still paying $60 to $70 billion a year on Centcom-related activities. That's more than twice as much money as we've spent on the US's most important imperial front this year, the war in Ukraine. Does that sound like a Middle East withdrawal to you? Beyond the formal administrative boundaries of Centcom and the US government, US empire in the Middle East is consolidating in many other ways, as some recent news stories make clear. In October, the Washington Post revealed that the United Arab Emirates is now an important part of the revolving door between the US military and the private sector, paying consulting fees to hundreds of retired US military personnel. Gulf influence in Washington, D.C. is so massive and so corrupting that an alarmed US intelligence community is actually beginning to push back a little bit. In June, a retired Marine general stepped down from his role as president of the Brookings Institution, possibly our most prestigious think tank, because the FBI accused him of acting as an unregistered lobbyist for Qatar. And just last month, the National Intelligence Council took the extraordinary step of compiling and then leaking the existence of a report on the UAE's many types of legal and illegal manipulation of the US political system. It would be nice to see this as a crackdown on Gulf money in Washington, D.C., but I think it's more likely that it's a warning and an attempt to set up some guidelines and boundaries to keep the money flowing more safely and legally. If we were seriously cracking down on this garbage, then Trump's son-in-law and Middle East policy lead, Jared Kushner, would currently be in jail for the $3 billion his businesses have taken from Qatar and Saudi Arabia. My suspicion is that there is no media outcry over these Trump family bribes because Democrat-linked figures are taking similar amounts of Gulf money, just in less idiotically obvious ways. The sad facts are that Centcom and the United States are in the Middle East to stay. Oil-rich Gulf monarchies will continue to interfere in U.S. politics for as long as there are oil-rich Gulf monarchies. The idea that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East is a myth. As with everywhere else in the world, the U.S. presence there is consolidating, not diminishing. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned recently that I have an email list? If I lose access to any of these platforms, it will be the only way for me to reach my audience. Please do sign up either at the link here or the link in the video description. Thanks.